The Greyhound bus groaned to a halt against the weathered curb of Oakhaven, exhaling a long, weary sigh of diesel and dust that immediately dissolved into the crisp October air of upstate New York. Clara stepped down onto the asphalt, her boots crunching softly against a scattering of amber maple leaves that had surrendered to the gravity of the season. She clutched the strap of her canvas duffel bag, the worn fabric grounding her against the disorienting vertigo of arrival. For the past 7 years, her life had been measured by the relentless metronome of city sirens, fluorescent office lights, and a career in Manhattan that demanded everything until she had nothing left to give. Burnout had not arrived as a sudden crash. Rather, it had bled into her spirit slowly, like ink pooling in water, until the color of her days was a monotonous, suffocating gray. Coming back to the house her grandfather built was not an act of surrender, but a desperate, quiet plea for a second chance at breathing. The town itself seemed to hold its breath around her, wrapped in the familiar embrace of rolling hills and distant purple ridges that had witnessed her childhood summers. As she walked the final half a mile down Maple Street, past neatly fenced yards and rusted mailboxes, the heavy armor she had worn for so long began to feel unnecessary, a clumsy weight she could finally afford to set down on the frosty earth, welcoming the quiet solace of a truly peaceful, healing, transformative, and sacred, unconditional homecoming today. The front door of the old timber house yielded to her brass key with a familiar, mournful creak that instantly bridged the chasm of decades. Stepping inside, Clara was enveloped by the scent of cedar wood, old paper, and the faint, sweet trace of dried lavender that her grandmother used to tuck between the linen sheets. Dust motes danced lazily in the slanting afternoon sunlight filtering through the paned windows, illuminating a stillness that felt both haunting and profoundly sacred. Every piece of furniture, from the scratched oak dining table to the floral armchair by the hearth, stood as a silent witness to lives lived with patience and intention, a stark contrast to the frantic disposability of her urban existence. She walked slowly down the hallway, her fingertips brushing against the floral wallpaper, tracing the contours of a heritage she had spent years trying to outrun. There was no electricity humming with urgency here, no notifications demanding immediate compliance, only the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a heartbeat that had somehow waited patiently for her return. In this quiet sanctuary, grief and nostalgia mingled in the air, not as sharp thorns, but as a gentle rain washing over parched soil. She realized that the ghosts inhabiting these rooms were not menacing specters of regret, but gentle guardians, reminding her of who she used to be before the world taught her how to build walls around her heart completely and build a fortress of unbroken isolation for her own fragile protection through the long and lonely years. Later that afternoon, drawn by an irresistible pull toward the backyard, Clara stepped out onto the weathered wooden porch where her grandfather used to sit carving wooden birds. The garden had overgrown its borders, wild goldenrod and crimson sumac mingling with forgotten patches of mint, reclaiming the earth in a joyful riot of untamed resilience. Standing at the edge of the lawn was the old apple tree, its gnarled branches heavy with late-season fruit that glowed like small lanterns in the declining sun. A sparrow landed abruptly on a low branch, tilting its head toward her with an inquisitive gaze that seemed entirely devoid of judgment or expectation. In that fleeting second, a profound wave of connection washed over her tired soul, reminding her that nature did not hurry. Yet everything was accomplished. Healing, she understood then, was not about fixing every broken piece of her past or erasing the scars etched by ambition and loss. It was about learning how to stand still amidst the wind and allow the roots to sink deeper into the fertile dark. She reached out and plucked a single dust-covered apple from the branch, feeling its cool weight in her palm. Taking a bite, the crisp, tart flavor exploded on her tongue, an immediate, grounding burst of life that anchored her thoroughly to the present moment, dissolving the lingering shadows of yesterday into the warm, golden light of today with quiet grace and unyielding inner strength that she had forgotten she possessed deep within her weary and longing human heart right now. As evening bled across the sky, painting the horizon in bruised shades of violet and amber, Clara sat on the front steps, wrapped in a woolen quilt. The autumn chill was settling in, but inside her chest, a strange, unfamiliar warmth began to radiate outward, melting the frost that had accumulated over years of striving. Dusk in Oakhaven arrived not with the shrieking alarms and blinding headlights of the metropolis, but with a profound, deep, and sacred silence that invited introspection. She looked up at the emerging constellations, pinpricks of eternal light scattered across the darkening velvet expanse, and felt the immense, terrifying vastness of the universe, not as a threat, but as an embrace. For so long, she had equated worth with productivity, believing that if she ever stopped running, she would cease to matter. Yet sitting here in the deepening twilight, surrounded by the whispers of the wind through the pines, she understood the radical truth of simply being. No deadlines loomed over her horizon. No critics waited in the wings to judge her faltering steps. There was only the steady rhythm of her own breathing, matching the heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet. In this quiet stillness, she finally gave herself permission to grieve the years lost to ambition, letting the silent tears fall freely into the cool night air as an offering of absolute release and gentle redemption that would carry her through the coming darkness toward a brighter and more authentic dawn, waiting silently beyond the horizon for her awakening spirit, right now, forever. Night fully embraced the valley, casting a blanket of velvet darkness, punctuated only by the distant, comforting glow of neighborly windows. Clara stood up from the porch steps, her joints stiff from the journey, yet somehow feeling lighter, as if a heavy cloak of lead had slipped from her shoulders and dissolved into the earth. She walked back inside the warm house, lighting a single beeswax candle on the kitchen counter that cast a soft, amber halo across the peeling paint and rustic wooden shelves. Tomorrow would bring its own questions, and the path to true healing would undoubtedly demand patience, courage, and countless moments of grace when old doubts crept back in. But tonight, standing in the heart of her childhood home, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The relentless chase was over. The frantic race against time had finally surrendered to the rhythm of seasons and steady breath. She climbed the stairs to her old bedroom, pulling the patchwork quilt over her shoulders as the wind whispered lullabies through the eaves. Closing her eyes, she welcomed the deep, restorative sleep she had been denying herself for years, trusting that the dawn would return faithfully, bearing the quiet promise of a brand new beginning for her waiting soul, with endless grace, absolute peace, and unwavering hope that would gently guide her spirit home to the true essence of her own heart, forever shining brightly into the vast and beautiful unknown of tomorrow, with love and sacred unyielding light, shining bright through every single quiet night. The cabin at the edge of the ridge smelled faintly of cedar and damp earth, a scent that anchored Clara to the marrow of the present moment. Weeks had dissolved into this rhythm of slow dawns and copper dusks, where the only urgency was the shifting of shadows across the hardwood floor. She spent her mornings watching the mist lift from the valley, peeling back like old parchment to reveal the resilient green of the pines below. It was a landscape that asked for nothing and offered everything. A vast sanctuary of quiet endurance that mirrored the deep and uncharted territories of her own healing heart. Here, the noise of her former life, the relentless ticking of expectations, and the sharp echoes of fractured promises softened into a distant hum, like wind moving through high wires. She learned to listen not to the frantic questions in her head, but to the steady and unhurried pulse of the earth beneath her boots. Each step along the winding trail was a deliberate act of reclamation, a way of gathering the scattered pieces of her soul and stitching them back together with the thread of quiet resilience. The solitude, once a terrifying void, had transformed into a spacious room where she could finally breathe without flinching. She realized that recovery was not a straight highway paved with sudden breakthroughs, but rather a winding dirt road filled with small and unheralded graces, quiet moments where yesterday lifted, allowing the warm light of today to touch skin that had been cold for far too long. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting golden dapples upon the mossy stones, where she often sat to reflect. In these quiet hours, memories would rise like gentle bubbles from the deep creek bed, surfacing before dissolving into the clear air. She thought of the letters she had never sent, words penned in haste and sorrow, that now seemed as weightless as dry autumn leaves. Forgiveness, she discovered, was not a grand declaration shouted from a mountaintop, but a quiet decision made in the privacy of one's own chest. It was the art of unclenching fists that had grown tired of holding on to grievances that only injured the holder. A brilliant blue jay landed on a nearby branch, tilting its crest as if appraising her silent transformation with curious approval. She smiled back at the bird, recognizing in that fleeting exchange the profound interconnectedness of all living things navigating their own seasons of repair. The ghosts of her past were no longer menacing specters demanding retribution, but rather faded teachers who had guided her to this exact threshold of grace. With every deep breath, she inhaled the rich scent of pine and balsam, exhaling the lingering residues of inner doubt that had shadowed her footsteps for years. The interior landscape of her mind was finally clearing, making room for a brand new narrative, written with ink of compassion and margin. She stood up slowly, brushing the dust from her knees, ready to embrace whatever gentle lessons the approaching evening had yet to reveal to her. Later that evening, she walked down the narrow dirt path toward the small village nestled safely at the base of the mountain. The golden lights from the rustic storefronts cast warm pools of amber across the gravel road, inviting weary travelers inside. Inside the cozy bakery, the sweet aroma of fresh cinnamon rolls and roasted hazelnuts wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. An elderly baker named Thomas looked up from his flour-dusted counter and greeted her with a remarkably warm, knowing smile. They spoke for hours about trivial things and profound universal truths, sharing stories that spanned decades of quiet joys and deep sorrows. Thomas handed her a warm loaf of freshly baked sourdough bread, insisting it was a gift for the lonely newcomer on the ridge. In that simple gesture of genuine hospitality, Clara felt the stubborn walls around her heart melt away into gentle, healing gratitude. Human connection, she realized once again, was the vital adhesive that mended the broken fragments of humanity when everything else fell apart. She walked back up the dark, winding mountain trail with the fragrant loaf cradled securely in her arms, guided only by starlight. The night air was brilliantly crisp and wonderfully clear, filled with the quiet promise that winter always gives way to spring. She placed the bread on her wooden table, lighting a single beeswax candle, whose steady flame flickered bravely against the darkness. Sitting by the quiet window, she watched the distant stars wheel across the immense night sky, feeling profoundly grateful for this wonderful new life. Sunrise arrived the next bright morning with an astonishing burst of amber and rose, painting the distant mountain peaks in brilliant hues. Clara woke up with a renewed sense of quiet purpose, humming softly through her veins like a newly tuned musical instrument. She gathered her leather-bound journal and a sharp pencil, sitting quietly on the small wooden porch to write down her thoughts. Words that had eluded her for many difficult months suddenly flowed onto the crisp white pages with effortless and surprising grace. She wrote honestly about the deep valleys of sorrow she had traversed and the unexpected peaks of joy she was now discovering. Writing became a sacred act of emotional alchemy, transforming leaden grief into pure gold through the sheer power of authentic expression. Every single sentence was a stepping stone across the turbulent river of her memories, leading her toward a peaceful and grounded shore. she realized deeply that her life story was not defined by its tragic chapters, but by her courageous willingness to keep turning pages. The morning breeze carried the crisp scent of fresh pine needles, whispering gentle encouragement through the branches of the ancient trees above. She looked out over the vast expanse of the green valley, feeling entirely at home in her own skin for the very first time. No longer running blindly from her shadows, she had learned to invite them to sit beside her as wise teachers of resilience. The long journey of emotional healing was demanding, yet it had gifted her boundless inner peace at last. As the warm afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long purple shadows across the green valley, Clara closed her journal with a quiet smile. She knew with absolute certainty that life would continue to present unexpected storms, but she no longer feared the fierce wind or rain. Her resilient roots had grown deep into the rich soil of self-acceptance, anchoring her securely against any tempest that might ever arise. She looked down at her hands, once trembling and fragile, now wonderfully steady and capable of building a beautiful new reality. The rustic cabin was no longer a lonely place of exile, but a sacred birthplace where she had rediscovered her truest, most authentic self. Stepping softly off the wooden porch, she walked toward the edge of the ridge to watch the sun melt into the distant western hills. The evening sky erupted in magnificent shades of crimson and gold, a breathtaking reminder that endings are often glorious new beginnings in disguise. She took one final deep breath of the fragrant mountain air, feeling a profound sense of completeness wash entirely over her grateful soul. She took one final deep breath of the fragrant mountain air, feeling a profound sense of completeness wash entirely over her grateful soul. Whatever lay ahead in the chapters yet unwritten, she was fully ready to step forward into the radiant light with courage and hope. The mountains stood silent witness to her transformation, ancient guardians of a secret shared only by those who survive the dark. She smiled out into the gathering dusk, knowing that her healing was not a destination reached, but an ongoing celebration of being alive. At last, her once restless heart found peace. The autumn wind carried the scent of damp pine and decaying leaves across the valley, whispering secrets that only those willing to listen could ever truly understand. Arthur stood at the precipice of the ridge, watching the mist slowly dissolve beneath the relentless touch of the morning sun. For months, the weight of his urban existence, the endless ticking of clocks, the hollow echoes of hurried footsteps, and the suffocating pressure of unfulfilled expectations had compressed his spirit into a fragile shell. He had fled to this forgotten corner of Maine, not to find answers, but to escape the deafening noise of his own regret. Every stone on this trail felt like a monument to a choice he wished he could unmake, a path he wished he had never walked. Yet, as he looked out over the endless expanse of amber and gold canopy, a strange stillness began to seep into his bones. It was a terrifying quiet at first, stripping away the armor of busyness he had worn for decades. He realized that The emptiness he feared was not a void to be dreaded, but a canvas waiting for a softer, more forgiving touch. The trees did not rush their growth. They simply endured the winter, trusted the spring, and surrendered to the autumn without bitterness. In that quiet revelation, the knot in his chest loosened just a fraction, allowing the crisp mountain air to fill lungs that had forgotten how to breathe deeply. This was where healing finally began, born not from triumph, but from a gentle acceptance. Stepping down the rugged path, Arthur followed the winding trail toward the creek, where the water hummed a steady, ancient lullaby over smooth river stones. The forest here was dense and sheltering, draped in a cathedral of towering hemlocks that filtered the harsh sunlight into pools of amber radiance. In this secluded sanctuary, the ghosts of his past felt distant, almost spectral, fading against the vibrant reality of the breathing woods. He remembered the arguments, the slamming doors, and the bitter silence that had ultimately shattered his marriage, leaving him adrift in a world that demanded continuous motion. Here, motion had a different rhythm, dictated by the migration of birds and the slow, graceful falling of leaves. He knelt by the water, dipping his calloused hand into the icy current, feeling the shock of cold wakefulness ripple through his veins. Water did not resist the obstacles in its path. It carved through them with patience, bending around granite boulders and finding a way onward without anger. Why had he spent so many years fighting every current, battering himself against circumstances he could never control? The realization washed over him with the gentle force of the tide, whispering that his struggles had not been failures, but lessons in resilience. He pulled his hand from the stream, watching the droplets sparkle in the light before falling back into the flow, realizing that letting go was not losing, but trusting the river to carry him where he needed to be, knowing that every single bend in the road held a quiet beginning. Sitting on a fallen mossy log, Arthur opened the small leather-bound journal he had carried faithfully in his coat pocket. The pages were mostly blank, smelling faintly of aged paper and ink, waiting to absorb the truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. For years, he had judged himself by the milestones he failed to achieve, measuring his worth by titles earned and bank accounts accumulated. Yet, sitting here, beneath the cathedral of trees, those metrics felt utterly absurd, like measuring the depth of the ocean with a ruler. He picked up his pen and began to write, his hand trembling slightly as the ink bled onto the page. He wrote about distant paternal expectations, the unspoken disappointments that hung over family dinners like winter frost, and how he had unconsciously spent his entire life trying to prove his own adequacy. He realized with a staggering clarity that the relentless drive pushing him forward was not ambition at all, but an overwhelming fear of being unloved. The tears came unbidden, hot and sudden, burning paths down his weathered cheeks as he finally gave himself permission to grieve for the boy who had never felt quite enough. It was a profound, aching release, washing away the stubborn calcification around his heart. In the quiet embrace of the forest, surrounded by ancient witnesses made of wood and leaf, he finally offered himself the radical gift of total and unconditional forgiveness, knowing with absolute certainty that the past could no longer dictate the sacred chapters yet to be written in future years. As afternoon slipped into evening, the forest canopy ignited in shades of violet and crimson, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor like welcoming arms. Arthur stood up from the log, his body feeling remarkably lighter, as though an invisible backpack of stones had finally slipped from his shoulders. He closed his journal, securing the elastic band with a firm click, and tucked it back into his pocket, where it rested securely against his chest. The silence of the woods no longer felt intimidating or desolate. Instead, it hummed with a companionable resonance, reminding him that he was part of something infinitely larger than his own fleeting sorrows. He began the walk back toward the cabin, his footsteps steady and measured on the familiar dirt path. Every breath he took felt cleaner, charged with the sweet fragrance of pine resin and damp earth. He noticed the delicate intricacy of a spiderweb glistening with dew between two branches, marveling at how something so delicate could withstand the evening breeze with such resilience. He was like that web, battered by storms and frayed by time, yet miraculously intact and capable of catching the golden light of the setting sun. He understood now that life was not about avoiding the inevitable tempests, but about learning how to bend without breaking, trusting with all his heart that morning always followed the darkest night, and knowing that every single step forward was a deeply triumphant return to his own authentic, resilient, and evolving human spirit. Arriving back at the wooden cabin as twilight cast its indigo veil across the clearing, Arthur felt a profound sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with peace. He unlocked the heavy front door, stepping inside the modest room that had become his sanctuary of reinvention. Lighting a single amber lantern on the wooden table, he watched as the warm glow chased the shadows from the corners, illuminating the quiet space where his healing had taken root. He stepped over to the small kitchen window, looking out toward the dark silhouette of the mountains rising majestically against the starlit evening sky. The stars above burned with an ancient, steady brilliance, reminding him that light always persists, no matter how vast the surrounding darkness might seem. He poured a cup of warm herbal tea, holding the ceramic mug between his hands and letting the soothing heat radiate through his palms. Tomorrow, he would return to the city, stepping back into the noise and demands of everyday existence. But he would not return as the same man who had fled in despair. He carried within him the unshakable stillness of the forest, the patient wisdom of the river, and the enduring strength of the trees that weathered every winter. He was ready to live fully, love deeply, and embrace whatever tomorrow brought with an open, fearless heart, knowing with absolute certainty that the journey home was never about a physical place, but about finally finding enduring peace deep within his true soul. The morning air arrived with the crisp, clean scent of damp pine needles and the distant metallic tang of a frost-tipped river, sweeping across the valley like an unspoken invitation to begin again. For months, the weight of what had been lost felt like a physical anchor dragging through the marrow of every decision, binding him to a shoreline of regrets he could neither inhabit nor abandon. Yet, standing here on the weather-worn cedar porch of the cabin, watching the heavy October fog lift in slow, theatrical curtains from the glassy surface of the water, a strange lightness fluttered behind his ribs. It was not the sudden, explosive epiphany that stories often promised, but rather the quiet, persistent erosion of despair, worn down by the relentless patience of time. He looked down at his calloused hands that had built fences, broken bread, and spent countless nights shielding flickering candles from the gale-force winds of his own internal tempest. They were scarred, but they were steady. The shadows that used to haunt the corners of his vision no longer wore the fangs of terror. Instead, they had softened into the familiar silhouettes of lessons hard-earned. In this stillness, far from the frantic hum of the metropolis and the deafening noise of unmet expectations, he realized that healing was not a destination where one finally laid down all burdens. The sun punched through the canopy, casting long, golden fingers across the frost-laden grass, illuminating the path ahead not with blinding certainty, but with just enough light to take the very next step. Down by the riverbank, where the slate-gray stones were slick with emerald moss and polished by decades of current, the river offered an eternal sermon on letting go. He spent hours watching fallen leaves get caught in gentle eddies before being swept effortlessly into the broader, unstoppable flow of the main channel. There was profound mercy in witnessing how the water accommodated every obstacle, swirling around jagged boulders rather than fighting them, smoothing down their rough edges over time. He thought about the years he had spent swimming upstream against his own history, exhausting his spirit in a futile war against the unchangeable past. Every grievance he had cradled like a precious heirloom had only served to weigh him down, anchoring him in a stagnant backwater while the world moved forward in its vibrant rhythm. Bending down, he scooped up a handful of cold water, letting it spill through his fingers until nothing remained except a clean chill on his skin. It was a lesson in impermanence he had finally begun to absorb. Pain, too, was a current that only held power when resisted. As he watched the water race toward the horizon under a vast cobalt sky, a heavy knot in his chest unspooled. The fierce need to understand every why evaporated, replaced by a profound acceptance of the present. In that quiet communion with the wild earth, he discovered that peace did not demand answers. It only required a willingness to open one's hands and trust the journey. Back inside, the warmth of the wood stove chased away the chill, filling the room with the comforting aroma of burning hickory and old paper. On the rustic wooden table lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the fragmented, jagged handwriting of a man trying to survive his own mind. He flipped back through the entries, pages marked by fierce self-reproach, midnight tears, and desperate questions addressed to an empty room. Yet, interspersed among the wreckage, there were glowing embers of grace. A stranger's unexpected smile at a roadside diner, the fierce loyalty of a companion, and the forgiving voice of a mother who loved him through his winters. He realized his story was not defined solely by ruin, but by the stubborn threads of connection that kept him tethered to humanity. Vulnerability, he understood, was not weakness. It was the sacred bridge that allowed light to enter broken places. He picked up a pen, and for the first time in months, he did not write of regret. Instead, he penned a simple letter of gratitude to the version of himself who had endured the unendurable, the stumbling soul who kept walking even when the map burned to ash. The ink flowed smoothly, a quiet testament to a heart finally learning to mend its own seams, with thread woven from forgiveness and fierce self-compassion. As twilight painted the western sky in bruised shades of violet and amber, he stepped back onto the porch to watch the evening stars pierce the velvet expanse. There was a profound transformation happening inside his chest, a steady expansion that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. For years, he had treated his heart like a fragile glass vessel that had to be guarded against any further impact, sealing it away behind high walls of cynicism. But sitting under the vast canopy of the cosmos, he saw the flaw in that design. A locked heart does not keep out the pain. It only imprisons the joy. The scars he carried across his spirit were not badges of defeat, but proof that he had dared to live, to care, and to bleed for things that mattered. They were the topography of a resilient life, mapping out valleys of sorrow and peaks of transcendent beauty. He pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the steady thud of his pulse, a living metronome declaring he was still here, still capable of wonder, still worthy of the dawn. The wind rustled through the pines, sounding like a chorus, whispering that it was safe to drop the armor. He exhaled a long breath, feeling the last vestiges of defense slide off his shoulders and dissolve into the fertile earth below. The night settled deep and profound, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of absolute stillness, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of embers in the hearth. He knew the road ahead would still hold its trials, that grief and doubt were not ghosts that could be permanently banished, but rather lifelong companions that would occasionally visit unannounced. Yet the fear of those future shadows had lost its grip on his soul. He was no longer running from his past, nor was he desperately chasing an idealized future. He was finally, beautifully, anchored in the sacred present. Tomorrow, he would pack his rucksack, lock the cabin door, and return to the bustling, imperfect world below, carrying with him a new kind of strength. Not the hard, brittle armor of defiance, but the supple, resilient grace of a willow branch that bends in the gale without snapping. He looked up one last time at the North Star, fixed and brilliant against the dark, guiding travelers through centuries of uncertainty. A quiet smile touched the corners of his mouth as he turned back toward the warm, inviting glow of the interior, feeling a deep, unshakable peace settle deep into his bones. The story of his life was unwritten, open-ended, and waiting for the ink of a new day. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, he was not afraid of what the next page might hold. He was ready to live. The dust motes drifted through the amber slats of late afternoon light, settling softly upon the worn wooden floorboards of the farmhouse kitchen. For many long months, time had not moved forward at all. It had merely pooled in the quiet corners, like stagnant rainwater, reflecting a profound grief so heavy it felt as though the walls themselves were leaning inward under the unbearable weight of an unsaid goodbye. Arthur stood by the deep porcelain sink, his hands submerged in lukewarm water, watching the soapy suds dissolve steadily into nothingness. There was an unexpected and quiet dignity in these small, repetitive domestic acts, such as the careful rinsing of a single ceramic mug, the gentle wiping of a worn wooden counter, that offered a fragile yet enduring anchor to a human mind adrift on a sea of memories. The vast landscape outside, stretching outward toward the jagged silhouette of the distant Blue Ridge Mountains, or the bruised purples and luminous golds of an approaching dusk. It was an ancient land that had witnessed its own share of bitter winters, yet every recurring spring it greened again, with a stubborn, silent resilience that defied despair. Arthur felt a faint, unfamiliar stirring deep within his chest. Not quite blooming joy, but rather the stark and distinct acknowledgement of sheer survival. The profound silence of the house no longer felt like a hollow, echoing void, but rather like a spacious waiting room, prepared for a fresh breath of life. He let out a long, slow breath of quiet release. To heal was not to bandage a wound until it disappeared beneath pristine linen, but rather to learn how to live beside the scar without trembling when the weather turned cold. Walking out onto the creaking front porch, Arthur pulled his wool sweater tighter against the crisp evening air that swept down from the ridges. The valley below was beginning to blur into violet shadows, obscuring the old fences and the overgrown fields where he had once labored with hands that now felt strangely light. He thought of Clara, of her laughter that used to fill these empty rooms like sunlight bouncing off polished silver. For a long time, remembering her had been like touching an exposed nerve, a sharp agony that made him want to retreat inward into absolute darkness. But tonight, as the first pale stars pricked the vast canvas of the night sky, the memory felt different. It was tender, akin to an old photograph worn soft at the edges by loving fingers. He realized that grace did not arrive in thunderclaps or sudden miraculous revelations. It crept in silently, through the small cracks left by sorrow. It lived in the willingness to remain broken, yet open. To accept that love does not perish simply because the beloved has stepped beyond the horizon. He sat down in the wooden rocking chair, letting its familiar rhythm soothe the restless cadence of his thoughts, finally ready to listen to the night with an open and steadfast heart that knew how to forgive both time and its own heavy sorrow. There is a peculiar strength that emerges only after everything you thought you depended upon has been stripped away, leaving you standing alone in the vast, quiet architecture of your own existence. Arthur watched a lone moth flutter against the warm glass of the porch light, its erratic flight a fragile reminder of how delicate living things truly are. He thought about the town down the road, Oakhaven, where people went about their daily business, buying flour at the general store, arguing over local politics, and carrying their own invisible burdens behind polite smiles. We are all, he realized, stitched together from fragments of endurance and unexpressed grief. To carry a scar was not a sign of defeat, but proof positive that you had dared to love something larger than yourself, risking vulnerability in a world governed by impermanence. The pain he had carried, like a physical weight for so long, was slowly transforming into something else, a deep, resonant wisdom that allowed him to look at the world with tender clarity. It was as if the sorrow had acted as a loom, weaving the chaotic threads of his losses into a durable, beautiful tapestry of peace. He did not need answers from the universe anymore. The sheer act of breathing in the cool night air was answer enough to keep him anchored firmly to the earth, where every living creature must eventually find its way home through the darkness by following the steady guidance of his own patient and enduring inner light burning within his weary soul. A gentle breeze rustled through the tall maples bordering the yard, carrying the crisp, earthy scent of damp soil and fallen leaves. It was the familiar music of the valley, a timeless song that had echoed across these hills long before any fences were built or names recorded in family Bibles. Arthur closed his eyes and breathed it in, feeling the cool air wash over his face like a benediction. In that quiet interval, the boundaries between himself and the wider world seemed to dissolve entirely. He was not merely a man sitting alone on a porch. He was part of the landscape, woven into the cyclical rhythm of growth and decay, of endings and quiet beginnings. Across the valley, a single yellow light flickered on in a farmhouse window, a small beacon cutting through the encroaching dark. It was a silent testament to human endurance, a reminder that behind every closed door, someone was tending a fire, sharing a story, or whispering a hope into the dark. We are never truly isolated, he reflected, as long as we can feel the invisible threads that bind our heartbeats to the collective pulse of humanity. He opened his eyes, feeling a profound sense of kinship with the whispering trees, the distant hills, and the vast starry sky stretching out above him in silent, magnificent embrace that reminded him that every heartbeat is a gift, and every tomorrow a new chance to walk forward with grace into the light of an unwritten day, waiting patiently just beyond the quiet horizon once again. The morning would arrive soon enough, bringing with it the golden promise of a new dawn and the steady work that awaited him in the fields. But tonight belonged entirely to this quiet reconciliation, this gentle truce between what had been lost and what was yet to come. Arthur stood up from the wooden rocking chair, feeling the strength returning to his limbs, steady and unshakable. He looked out across the shadowy lawn one last time before turning toward the warm glow of the kitchen window, calling him back inside. The house no longer felt like a monument to absence. It was simply home, a place of shelter and quiet becoming. He knew there would still be difficult moments, days when the shadows would lengthen and memory would whisper old sorrows into the stillness of the room. Yet he also knew he possessed the courage to meet them without fear. He stepped across the threshold, closing the screen door with a soft, familiar click that echoed gently in the night. The road ahead was long and untraveled, but for the first time in years, his steps felt sure, grounded in the deep conviction that life, in all its broken beauty, was entirely worth living. With a calm and steady heart, he walked into the warm light, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow might bring with open arms and a spirit that had finally learned how to sing its own quiet song of hope beneath the vast and endless dome of the starlit American sky. The morning air carried the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine and damp earth, a familiar breath of the New England woods that had witnessed both the quiet fracturing and the slow, agonizing mending of Arthur's spirit. For months, the old house had felt like a mausoleum of unsaid things, its floorboards groaning beneath the heavy ghost of winter and memory. Yet, as the first amber fingers of dawn stretched across the rusted tin roof, something shifted in the atmosphere. Not a sudden miracle, but the subtle, relentless grace of a new day breaking through the dense canopy. Arthur stood on the weathered porch with a chipped ceramic mug warming his calloused palms, watching the low-hanging mist lift slowly from the valley below. He had spent years running from the absolute silence, believing it to be an insidious enemy that only amplified his deepest regrets. Now, in the crisp stillness of sunrise, he understood that silence was merely a blank canvas, waiting patiently for the ink of a fresh beginning. The winding dirt road leading down the ridge was entirely empty, stretching into the hazy horizon like an unwritten promise, inviting him to finally release the rusted anchor of what used to be and step into the boundless, terrifying beauty of what could still happen in this lifetime. It was a fragile awakening, born from the very ashes of emotional exhaustion, yet it pulsed with a quiet, undeniable heartbeat that urged him to breathe deeply, trust the fragile light, and let the healing truly begin. Inside the quiet, dim kitchen, the old brass clock maintained its steady, uncompromising tick, measuring out the quiet seconds of a life that Arthur had once thought was entirely broken, beyond any hope of repair. He vividly remembered the cold autumn night he packed his belongings into worn cardboard boxes, fleeing from the wreckage of a failed marriage and the suffocating guilt of professional failure. For a very long time, he blindly believed that leaving was the absolute only act of mercy left to him. a way to spare others the sharp shrapnel of his ongoing disillusionment. But profound isolation had proven to be a remarkably poor companion, wrapping him in a suffocating cocoon of bitter introspection that hardened his heart against the simple warmth of human connection. Touching the scarred wooden kitchen table, he traced the deep gouges and accidental burns carved into the surface by decades of messy living, enduring marks of laughter, heated arguments, spilled wine, and quiet reconciliations. He finally realized that homes, much like human souls, were never meant to remain pristine and unblemished. Their true, enduring value lay in the trials they weathered and the quiet grace they harbored. The heavy scars he carried were not badges of ultimate shame, but undeniable proof of survival through endless dark nights. In that room, confronting his reflection in the glass, a deep forgiveness took root, whispering gently that it was never too late to embrace the morning sun and begin again with courage and love in his newly healing and hopeful chest. Stepping back outside, Arthur was greeted by the unexpected arrival of Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor, whose garden had somehow survived every harsh frost the valley had ever thrown at it. Leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane, she paused by the split-rail fence, offering him a weathered smile that crinkled the corners of her wise eyes like ancient parchment. There were no grand pronouncements exchanged between them, no probing questions about his prolonged absence or the heavy silence that had defined his hermitic life. 4 decades. Instead, she simply handed him a small clay pot containing a resilient green shoot, a cutting from her famed heirloom lilac bush that bloomed stubbornly against all odds every single spring. In that modest gesture, the invisible barrier separating Arthur from the rest of the world dissolved into the morning mist. He understood the profound language of her gift. Community and healing were not abstract philosophies to be studied in books, but daily acts of tending, planting, and sharing the burden of existence with one another. As their hands brushed briefly over the cool terracotta rim, a jolt of human warmth surged through his veins, awakening parts of his spirit that he had long believed were frozen permanently beneath the snow. It was a gentle reminder that we are never truly meant to walk our winding paths alone, and that even the smallest gesture of human kindness has the miraculous power to tether a drifting, weary soul safely back to the vibrant, living shore of boundless and enduring hope and grace. Planting the lilac shoot near the front steps became an act of profound communion with his future. Kneeling in the dark, fertile soil, Arthur felt the earth give way beneath his fingers, yielding to the pressure of his hands just as his resistance had finally yielded to the quiet currents of grace. Every spadeful of dirt represented an old fear buried, a past expectation let go, a silent grievance laid to rest under the watchful gaze of the morning sun. He remembered how desperate he had once been to control every outcome, to engineer a flawless existence that would immunize him against pain and disappointment. How foolish that illusion seemed now, viewed from the vantage point of a heart that had been cracked open by sorrow and remade by acceptance. Pain was not an aberration in the human story. It was the very chisel that carved depth into character, transforming smooth, shallow stones into faceted jewels of empathy and wisdom. As he tamped the rich soil firmly around the tender roots and watered them with a steady hand, a profound sense of inner peace washed over him, washing away the last lingering remnants of bitterness. He was no longer a fugitive hiding from his own history. He was a participant in the ongoing, beautiful tapestry of life, embracing both the bitter frost and the inevitable blooming spring with equal reverence, knowing that every single season serves a sacred purpose in the grand architecture of human spiritual evolution, personal growth, and radiant redemption. Standing back up, Arthur wiped his calloused hands on his denim trousers and looked out toward the distant horizon, where the morning sun had now fully cleared the eastern ridge, flooding the quiet valley with golden, uncompromising light. The winding road he had once feared walking down no longer looked like an escape route from his painful failures, but rather an inspiring invitation to step forward into the wide world with renewed courage, profound humility, and an open soul. He knew full well that the road ahead would still hold its share of inevitable shadows, that grief and doubt would occasionally revisit his doorstep like unbidden guests. But he was no longer afraid of the dark. He had finally learned the sacred art of beginning again, of holding compassionate space for his own brokenness, while trusting implicitly in the quiet, persistent capacity of the human heart to heal, forgive, and love once more. With a deep, steadying breath that filled his lungs with the crisp scent of pine and damp earth, he turned away from the porch railing and walked slowly back inside, not to hide from the world, but to greet the unfolding day. The story of his life remained unwritten, waiting patiently for the ink of his own deliberate choices. And for the very first time in many long years, he was completely ready to pick up the pen and write his own redemption with steady, fearless, and loving hands toward a truly bright, beautiful, and limitless future that awaited him.